Okay, Deuteronomy chapter 12, and we're going to start in verse 1 and just read that verse, and then we'll unpack the rest of the chapter in a moment. Deuteronomy 12:1 says, "These are the statutes and rules that you shall be careful to do in the land that the Lord, the God of your fathers, has given you to possess all the days that you live on the earth." Now this verse kicks off a whole chunk of Deuteronomy, chapters 12 through 26, that are primarily chapters concerning laws and statutes, behaviors, and how to follow God and love God in the land. And this section of Deuteronomy can feel a little bit irrelevant to our lives, because the commands about where we should cook our food and the commands about stoning people in our midst and all the rest of it, like, does that really matter? Does that apply to us today? And we need to have a good grid for reading these rules and these commands and figure out how they apply to us. But at their very heart, these rules, these statutes, and these commands, as we've been seeing in the first 11 chapters of Deuteronomy, are intended to help God's people establish habits of freedom. The entire rationale behind the giving of the law is that God has set his people free. And now, as they're about to move into the promised land, and they're literally sitting on the border, looking over the Jordan River into that place of promise that God has given them, Moses is delivering these words, these laws, these rules and statutes, so that when the people get in there, they don't face plant, but rather establish habits of freedom. Now, we all have habits. Everybody has habits. In fact, just think for a moment about your own habits, and then maybe just lean over, and if you know your neighbor, tell your neighbor the most annoying habit they have. Don't do that. Don't do that. You can talk about that later. Right, but we have habits. The people next to us have habits. You have habits that you want to stop. Like lately, I've been in this rut of eating ice cream every night before I go to bed. And so I want to stop it, but I also don't want to stop it because I really enjoy the ice cream before bed, right? You have habits that you want to start. I've been wanting to start flossing for about 2 decades. Just can't quite get that habit rolling. We have habits that annoy us and annoy others. I have this habit, I don't take the trash out of my car as regularly as I would like. And so just like after a week, I'll get in my car and I'll look down and there'll be like 3 wrappers, 4 receipts, and 2 fast food bags just sitting in the passenger seat floor. And I annoy myself. Do you guys ever do that? Like, oh, I'm so annoyed with myself. This habit of leaving my trash in the car needs to change. We have habits that we're not even aware of. Things that we do and that we say that just are on autopilot, and we've done it so many times that we don't even recognize it anymore. In fact, that's part of the definition of a habit. It's like when your brain kind of goes into autopilot. One of these for me was a speaking tic. A few years ago, I was doing Jesus and the Quran, and we were down in Houston with a church, and I had gotten into the habit of saying, "Does that make sense?" after just about every sentence. And so at a break, one of the people in attendance at the conference came up to me and said, "You don't have to keep asking us if it makes sense. It does. Just stop." And I didn't even know that I was saying it, you know? It's just one of those mental ruts or routines or habits that was tagging on to the end of every one of my sentences. Does that make sense? Sounds natural and normal until I start saying it at the end of every sentence. So you have to excise some of those habits from our lives. But the thing is, as scientists have studied habits, they have found that these habits affect every area of our lives. So it's not just behaviors like flossing that can become habitual, But we also can fall into habitual thought patterns. So the way we think, we just get thrown into a loop of processing certain thoughts. Something happens and automatically our brain goes down a road of thought that we don't even intentionally choose. Furthermore, habits work into our emotions. And so similarly, something can happen and it'll send us on a habitual emotional odyssey. Sometimes that's good, it's rejoicing. Sometimes it's bad, it's depressing, right? But these habits, they're extremely powerful. In fact, Wendy Wood is one of the researchers of habits out there. She estimates that 40 to 45% of the decisions we make are shaped by our habits, right? That's amazing. Almost half of our lives are lived habitually. Now, in one sense, this can be a really good thing. God designs our habits to work for us. If we have healthy habits, then those habits, those sort of autopilot loops in our life, take care of much of the details so that we can intentionally choose the stuff in the rest of our lives and make wise decisions. So actually, if you have good habits, it frees up an enormous amount of your brain space and your heart space and your behavior space to be choosing and interacting with the living, breathing, moving world around us. But the problem is if you have really rotten habits, then almost half of your life is built on a foundation of behaviors and activities that you actually wouldn't choose if you were choosing. But you're not really choosing because it's just habitual and you're just doing it automatically. And so Wendy Wood, I mentioned her, she did an amazing study with popcorn. Okay, so she had people eat popcorn, and she gave some people fresh popcorn and she gave some people stale popcorn, right? And what she found, unsurprisingly, is that the people in the study liked the fresh popcorn, ate a lot of the fresh popcorn. But the people who had the stale popcorn ate very little of it and said, this is stale, right? Something all of us have experienced, I think. But if you take those same people and you put them into a movie theater with the movie rolling and the lights down, and you serve them popcorn, the people with habits of eating popcorn in movies eat just as much stale popcorn as they would fresh popcorn, right? Do you see what happens? Given a choice about the issue, I will not eat a lot of stale popcorn. But put me into a situation that triggers a habit, like sitting in a movie theater, and I love to eat popcorn in movie theaters, then just, if you put popcorn in my hands, it doesn't matter if it's stale or fresh or whatever else, I'm just gonna eat it, you know? Have you ever found yourself, the habits of popcorn eating in movie theaters can be really grotesque. It's like the ratio of the popcorn bin and then your hand and the mouth, like all of these are different sizes, and yet we still try to get all of this into one handful and then just cram it into our mouths. You guys ever do this? And it's habitual, actually. For some of us, these habits overtake our conscious decision making, right? Now, this discussion of habits is so appropriate and relevant to the book of Deuteronomy, because as we've been reading Deuteronomy, what we're seeing is that God is challenging the people to establish habits of freedom. Not the kind of habits that enslave us, but rather the habits that set us free to live godly and live in a fulfilled manner with the people around us, to flourish in that promised land living. So remember, the story of Deuteronomy, the first 4 chapters, is just Moses reminding the people, God has set you free. Then you get to chapter 5, and Moses gives them the 10 commandments. And he says, these 10 commandments, because God has set you free, will form the foundation of your life in the promised land. These are gonna be the values, the things that everyone agrees on. These are the essential words, actually. In the original Hebrew, it's not even commandments, it's just the 10 words that are the building blocks of their lives in the land. And then as we've begun to talk about, these 10 words are actually like the table of contents for the book of Deuteronomy. So we almost could call it like the table of commandments. Let's go ahead and bring up that slide that shows the structure of this big central section. Last week, we spent some time talking about that first command, you shall have no other gods before me. And Moses gives his longest and most detailed and most compelling sermon on this first command, you shall have no other gods before me. And then we'll see this morning, don't make for yourself a carved image. That's in chapter 12. And then the rest of the commands really are shaping the content of the laws that kind of seem random at first glance. So we'll show you how this works with the second commandment today. I was gonna try to do the second and the third commandment today, but it just got a little too much. And so we're gonna actually only do that second command. We'll pick up the third command next week. But remember, at the core of all these 10 commandments that give shape to the book of Deuteronomy is this great statement of the first commandment known as the Shema. Let's go ahead and pull up that verse. And this echoes through the entire book of Deuteronomy. If there's one thing, they ask Jesus, of all the law that's so important, it stands above the rest, what is it? And Jesus cites this very verse, right? So this is the way that Moses unpacks that first command. You shall have no other gods before me. And he says this very thing. And the word Shema in Hebrew means to hear or listen. And so this is called the Shema because the first word there is hear. And I'd love for us just to recite this again together so that it casts its shadow over everything else that we see and do in this passage. So let's say it together. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might. Yeah. Amen. And then immediately after this, it says that you are to teach this to your children. You're to talk about it when you wake up, talk about it when you go to sleep, talk about it in your coming and your going, talk about it in your house, talk about it in your gates. Like, let this shape the conversation of your life. And then it says, now put reminders, bind this to your wrist, keep it on your forehead, put it on your doorpost. Like, remind yourself again and again and again that you are to love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your might. And what we see here is guidance from God about establishing habits of freedom. Long before there were sociologists and anthropologists researching how we eat popcorn in movie theaters. It's like God designed us to operate in a certain way, to live in freedom. And then his word amazingly clicks right in with our design to teach us and show us how to establish healthy habits of freedom so that what we choose and what we habitually do all align in oneness with our love for the one true God. Now, this is interesting because of the way that habits work, right? So they've begun to break down these habits into different parts. And I just want to show you this quick video that explains a bit about how habits function practically in our lives. And then we're going to take that little grid and use it as we read chapter 12 to see how God is giving us this amazing guidance for healthy habits. So let's go ahead and roll this video.
Imagine for a moment that you have a habit that you really want to change. Let's say, for instance, you go up to the cafeteria every afternoon and you eat a chocolate chip cookie. This habit has caused you to gain a little bit of weight. In fact, this habit has caused you to gain exactly 8 pounds, and your wife has started making some pointed comments. And when I say you, what I really mean is me, because this is a habit that I had that I just couldn't kick. To understand why that habit was so powerful and what it would take to change it, I had to learn how habits work. Every habit functions the same way. At first, there's a cue, some type of trigger that makes the behavior unfold automatically. Studies tell us that a cue can be a location, a time of day, a certain emotional state, other people, or just a pattern of behaviors that consistently triggers a certain routine. To figure out the cue for my craving, I spent a few days tracking exactly when the urge to eat a cookie hit. And what I noticed pretty soon was something interesting. The cookie craving always hit about between 3 o'clock and 3:30 in the afternoon. That was my cue. It was a certain time of day. The next part in the habit loop is the routine, the behavior itself. And for me, that was pretty easy to figure out. Every day between 3 and 3:30, I'd get this craving for a cookie. I'd get up out of my chair. I'd walk over to the elevator. I'd take the elevator up to the 14th floor. I'd get out. I'd buy a cookie, and then I would eat it while talking to my colleagues in the cafeteria. The last part of the habit loop is the reward. And in some respects, the reward is the most important part because that's why habits exist, so that we can get the rewards that we want. But figuring out a reward is kind of tricky. To figure out what reward was driving my habit, I did a little bit of an experiment. One day when the cookie urge struck, instead of going up to the cafeteria, I went outside and I took a walk around the block. Then the next day, I went up to the cafeteria, but instead of buying a cookie, I got a candy bar and then ate it at my desk. And then the day after that, I went up to the cafeteria again, but I didn't buy anything. Instead, I just talked to friends for about 10 minutes. You get the idea. What I was trying to do was test different hypotheses to figure out what reward I was actually craving. And what I figured out pretty quickly was it had nothing to do with cookies. It had to do with socializing. Nowadays, what happens is at about 3:30 in the afternoon, I absentmindedly stand up, I look around the office, I see a friend, I'll walk over and we'll gossip for 10 minutes and then I'll go back to my desk. The urge to go get a cookie has completely disappeared. The new behavior has become a habit, and I've lost about 12 pounds as a result. Studies have shown that if you can diagnose your habits, you can change them in whichever way you want. So what are the cues, routines, and rewards in your life? What habit do you want to change? The power of habit. Why we do what we do in life and business. Learn more at thepowerofhabit.com.
Yeah, so there's the advertisement for the book at the end. But interesting, right? This whole idea of cue and routine and reward. And I mean, obviously we're not endorsing gossip as a weight loss strategy. Socializing is a better word. Or in Christian circles, sharing prayer requests. That was a funny laugh. It kind of went, ha-ha, ooh. Oh, yeah. Anyway, yeah, so here's this study, right? And Duhigg in his book unpacks a bunch of the different studies that have revealed this, but really talks a lot about the shape of a habit that begins with a cue, sort of a trigger, sends you into a routine that is in some way motivated by a reward at the end. And these habit loops, they work all the time through our lives. And the interesting thing is that usually if we're trying to establish or change a habit, we focus on the routine. So working out as an example, man, I really want to start working out more regularly. And we think about, well, maybe if I just get the right routine. And so we pick this DVD set, or we find a new DVD set that's being promoted on TV. It's like, oh, these workouts will work. Or actually, no, if I just get this membership to this gym, then I will do it. So all of our focus is on getting the right routine, when in fact, the trigger, the cue of the habit and the reward of the habit are more important. And so wanting to change habits or establish healthy habits of freedom has a huge amount to do with getting the right cue, the right trigger, and the right reward in place. And the routine is important, but you never get to the routine regularly. It never becomes habitual unless that cue and that reward are correct. Now, Deuteronomy 12, we finally made it. Deuteronomy 12, as we just saw, is an explanation or commentary on the second command. And you have that second command from Deuteronomy 5 there on your notes sheet. God says, you shall not make for yourself a carved image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is on the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers and the children to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing steadfast love to thousands of those who love me and keep my commandments. So here is this great command, the second word of the 10 commandments: no carved images. And the language here is do not bow down or serve something that you've made with your own hands. The idea is that your temptation will be to have a possession or creation of your own hands that you will attach the affection of your heart to. And this command is saying, don't do this. Do not attach yourself in this way with anything other than God. In fact, the word used throughout Deuteronomy for this kind of attachment relationship is a covenant, that life-giving, committed connection. And specifically, Israel is called into a covenant of worship with God. And that idea of the worship is the attachment, the connection, the bowing down, the input on the decisions of our lives. What do you have to consult before making major decisions, right? This is revealing of what we worship. Who or what rules our lives? That's the question involved here. And this command, this word says, be careful, do not worship. Do not bow down, don't serve, don't listen to the work of your own hands. Don't attach yourself to anything other than God. Now, verse 2 of Deuteronomy 12, God says, and this is, remember, elaborating on that second command we just talked about, you shall surely destroy all the places where the nations whom you shall dispossess served their gods, on the high mountains and on the hills and under every green tree. You shall tear down their altars and dash in pieces their pillars and burn their asherim with fire. You shall chop down the carved images of their gods and destroy their name out of that place. You shall not worship the Lord your God in that way. Now, at first, that seems pretty intense. Why would we have to go out of our way to wipe the name of every pagan god and smash down every foreign idol? I mean, can't we just leave it up at the top of that mountain or over there in that grove of trees, like just not worry about it, just sort of live and let live? But this is where the understanding of how we operate is so important. Do you realize that each of these places, these asherim, these high places, these towers, all of this, they're cues, aren't they? They're the kind of things that you walk past and they can begin to trigger, that would then lead into a routine and a reward, a habit that is shaped more by the Canaanite world than by the words of the one true God. Why do we need to get rid of all these idols? Why do we smash this stuff? Why do we be careful? Well, because they function as cues or triggers that lead us not into habits of freedom, but habits of slavery to these pagan gods and these false ways. And so verse 4 says, you shall not worship the Lord your God in this way. Now, verse 5 talks about establishing the habit God desires. But you shall seek the place that the Lord your God will choose out of all your tribes to put his name and make his habitation there. And there you shall go, and there you shall bring your burnt offerings and your sacrifices, your tithes and the contribution that you present, your vow offerings, your free will offerings, and the firstborn of your herd and of your flock. And there you shall eat before the Lord your God, and you shall rejoice, you and your households, in all that you undertake, in which the Lord your God has blessed you. Now, this is amazing because God says, smash the cues of the pagan world. Don't look at them every day as you walk to and from your fields. and instead worship in the place where God will choose for his name to dwell. This, of course, is referring to wherever the tabernacle may be. Eventually, it ended up in Jerusalem. But God commands that there be an intentional displacement from your home territory to get to this centralized location and to bring with you your sacrifices and your offerings and your physical acts of worship. The list here is very interesting. It actually talks about burnt offerings, which you go back to the book of Leviticus, is about atonement, and the animal is brought and the entire thing is consumed. You have the sacrifice offerings. That's where just the fat of the animal is given to God through fire, and then the rest, the meat of the animal, is split between the people who bring the offering and the priests. You have the tithe, which is really a 10%. That word tithe literally means 10% of everything that you gather from the land, right? So this is just 10% that you bring in. Contributions, vows would be anything that you intentionally commit to God. Your free will offerings, that would be something that spontaneously, oh yeah, I want to help with that. And then the firstborn is kind of a first fruit. He mentions all 7 of these different kinds of contribution. And the interesting thing is that these contributions are their wealth. These are their resources and their possessions. And as we saw, the temptation is constantly to turn our possessions and the work of our own hands into our idol, into that what we worship. We have a tendency to make a habit of consulting our checking accounts, of being shaped in all of our decisions by our possessions. And here God is saying, in order to safeguard against the tendency of the human heart to make a habit of boiling down your possessions and turning them into a golden calf that you worship, take a portion, all these different kind of offerings, the tithe, the vow, free will, all of this stuff. Take a portion of your stuff and bring it to God where he commands and offer it to him there, right? So the cue in this godly habit of freedom is recognizing that amongst all of your wealth, there is a portion that is devoted to God. The routine is bringing that devoted portion to where the Lord desires, not where you desire, but saying, God, this is what you desire. This is the place where you've chosen for your name to dwell. This is your work, and I'm trusting it into your hands. And then the amazing thing is that the reward in this habit is a huge party. Did you catch that? Verse 7, there you shall eat before the Lord your God, and you shall rejoice, you and your households, in all that you undertake, in which the Lord your God has blessed you. So gather up all that stuff, go to the place with the pieces of your life and resources and possessions that are devoted to God, and then throw a huge party. Give it to God, God gives it immediately back to you, and have a big feast. It goes on to describe this feast in the next section. It's just amazing. If you go down to verse 12, you shall rejoice before the Lord your God, you and your sons and your daughters, your male servants, your female servants, and the Levite, the priest, that is within your town, since he has no portion or inheritance with you. Take care. You do not offer your burnt offerings at any place that you see, but at the place the Lord will choose in one of your tribes. There you shall offer your burnt offerings, and there you shall do all that I am commanding you. It's amazing. And the idol, right, in the ancient world, you would put an idol in a temple, you'd worship it, whatever else, as a symbol of the presence of God. And here, God says, come to the place where my name is, not my idol. Don't worship your stuff, bring your stuff in worship, surrender it before me, and then use that same offering as a celebration with everybody, the people in your town, slaves, servants, religious people, the Levites, family, everybody throw a big party with that stuff. It's almost like instead of an idol, God himself is saying, I myself am coming to dine with you in your presence. You've given this to me and I'm returning it to you immediately, and let's eat it all together. And so this is really the spirit and the heart that underlies the Old Testament command of the tithe. I know sometimes even in modern day churches, we talk about tithing and giving a 10%, or do we bring sacrifices anymore? Wasn't Jesus the final sacrifice? Are we really bringing burnt offerings? And besides, most of us don't have goats or lambs or oxen anymore anyway, right? So there's all these sort of questions of adapting the Old Testament model to the New Testament. But without getting into all of those details, the spirit behind this kind of offering to God is one of rejoicing. It's not a duty. It's not a, oh man, I gotta go write the check or take the goat or whatever. It's like, hey, go in to the place where God's people are gathered, where he has established his name, and celebrate and enjoy what God has given you in the presence of God as a reminder that everything you have and everything that you enjoy and all of your possessions are from the hand of God. This is not a dutiful burden for the people. This is God, the generous host, inviting the people to come, give of what they have, to be generous. That generosity spills over into the whole community, even the slaves in the household, even everybody. It just flows over like that, and you throw a big party with what you have. Why? Because our tendency with all of our blessings, with the stuff that we possess, our tendency is to turn that stuff into that which we worship. Our tendency is to turn that stuff into images, into idols, into the stuff that dominates our lives. And God says, hey, let me teach you a habit of freedom so that you recognize that everything you have comes from me and that I am enormously generous. It's not a promise that everyone who follows God is going to be rich, but it is a reminder that God's character is a character of abundance toward his people. Then it goes on to explain what to do if you need to kill an animal so that you can eat meat at a meal outside of that centralized moment of worship. So maybe you'd only go up to that place of worship and celebrate the party and bring all your tithes and offerings and all the rest in like once a year, or maybe several times a year. There's some festivals we'll get to in a couple of weeks when the people are commanded to kind of pack up and go to the new place. And you know, the interesting thing about this is going to a new place. As scientists study the formation of habits, they actually say that the best time to break an old habit and start a new habit is when you're in a new place or you're in a major transition of life, because all of the cues and triggers of the old place or the old work job or whatever else that you have are suddenly sort of gone for a minute. So you've got a clean slate and you have the opportunity to establish new cues and new routines and new rewards. And so it's amazing here because God is saying, now you're about to come into a brand new place. You used to live in the wilderness. You got all these habits built on wilderness living. You're about to come into this whole new place, and I want you to build these new habits that are right and healthy and life-giving. I'm the Lord your God who set you free from slavery. I want you to do that in the new place. And then once a year, or twice, or 3 times a year, I want you to disrupt the habits of your everyday life to come alongside to the place that I will command my name to dwell, and there reestablish these fresh habits with your stuff, because our heart's so easily attached to our stuff. But even beyond that, God goes further still, says, let me teach you some more habits about how to handle your stuff, what you own, your possessions, your meat. If you want to eat meat in a season outside of the time when you're up at that centralized location, Jerusalem, the temple, tabernacle, what have you. If you want to eat meat then, you can. Look at verse 15. You may slaughter and eat meat within any of your towns, as much as you desire, according to the blessing of the Lord your God that he has given you. The unclean and the clean may eat of it, as of the gazelle and as of the deer. Only you shall not eat the blood. You shall pour it out on the earth like water. It says, you may not eat within your towns the tithe of your grain or of your wine or of your oil, the firstborn of your herd, of your flock. You shall eat them before the Lord your God. But then eventually it says, if you become so spread out in the territory that you've taken that you can't make the journey, you can celebrate with the tithe in your town. But that gets into some of the finer details. The point here is that if you're just eating meat regularly, kind of daily, you can kill it and eat it in your town. And this is a change because back in Leviticus, it said anytime you wanted to eat meat, when you're traveling in the wilderness, you had to take it up to the tabernacle and the priest had to help. Every time you cut up an animal and everything else, you had to take it up. So it's like the opposite of going to the grocery. You had to take it up there, slaughter it, and bring it home. But here, he says you can eat it in your towns, but before you eat it, drain the blood out because the life is in the blood. And this is, again, another habit that God is giving to his people to help them with the second command about images and where their heart aligns. And this is talking about the life that comes from God is in the blood. And so before you eat the animal, before you cook it and season it, throw it in the crock pot, whatever you do, drain the blood out. Why? If the life comes from God, the draining of the blood is a reminder that this animal is a gift from God. You see this? This is a habit. Every time that you eat a meal with meat in it, remember that God is the one who supplied it. This is, again, one of those cues and routines and rewards that leads to free living, where our hearts are not bound up in our possessions or making images and idols of our own wealth and our own possessions. Essentially, God says 10%, give or take, bring in to the place where my name dwells and celebrate with it there for the sake of overflow into the entire community. 90%, keep it home, you can eat it, enjoy it, live well. I'm the God of abundance. But 100%, always establish the habit of remembering it all comes from God. Whether you're taking it up to the place where God commanded or you're eating at home and letting the blood drain out, no matter what, establish a habit of freedom to remember that all of this that we eat, all this that we breathe, all this that we live in, all this that we have is from God himself. It's the first Sunday of the month, so we're going to celebrate communion. I'm going to invite the ushers to go ahead and start distributing the elements because there's an interesting connection here between this Old Testament law and the meal that Jesus gave to his disciples. We're talking about food laws and the people establishing habits of freedom relative to their possessions, their gifts, and their offerings. Jesus, the night before he went to the cross, went to celebrate the Passover meal with his disciples. In fact, the reason he was in Jerusalem in the first place was because it was the season of Passover, and these Old Testament laws said when you go up to worship for these major festivals, I got it, Art, thanks, buddy. For these major festivals, you need to go to the place where the Lord's name dwells. So this is actually, Jesus is in Jerusalem for the Passover festival because of laws like this that we just read. So they're working their way out in Jesus' life. And Jesus knows he's about to go to the cross. He's about to die for the sin of all mankind. He's about to die as the final and total sacrifice. He's about to die to overcome evil. And so he takes the elements, the common elements of the meal. Almost every meal in the Jewish world would have at least had bread and the cup. And he takes those common elements, and they were uniquely noticed and celebrated at the Passover, but still they're the common elements. He says, guys, okay, here's this bread. And he tore some off, and he started handing it around to the guys in the room. He says, I want you to remember when you eat this bread, it's my body broken for you. And then he took the cup and he passed it around. He said, I want you guys to remember that when you drink this cup, it's my blood poured out for you. It's the blood of the new covenant, the true life-giving connection. Like the old covenant breaking away, the new covenant through me, connecting you to God. That's what this cup is about. It's the forgiveness of sins. And so here Jesus is taking that same principle we saw in Deuteronomy that understands the human condition so well. He's saying, guys, I want you to establish a new habit of freedom. And every time you see the cue of this bread and this cup, I want you to remember forgiveness. And that cue is going to send you into a routine where you begin to reflect on your life, on anything that may be enslaving your heart, anything that might be driving you away from God, anything that might be drawing you into a place of opposition to God's heart. And the reward is the celebration of a meal together with God, remembering his abundance and how much he has given us in Jesus, how much he loves us, that he would send Jesus to die on our behalf. See here, the communion, in very similar ways to these commands of Deuteronomy, the communion cultivates a habit of freedom in us. By breaking away and reminding us that Jesus' work has broken away the stuff that enslaves us and drawing us forward into the new covenant and the forgiveness of sins. And so I just want, as we reflect on these elements, I just want you guys to think about habits in your life. And Lord, would you just show us if we have patterns and habits that are enslaving us? Lord, show us if we have any deep-rooted allegiance to our possessions, to money, to mammon, to our reputation, to the work of our own hands. Lord, would you just reveal any enslaving habits?